What if I told you that modern home insulation technology is just a poor attempt to replicate what settlers did for free a century and a half ago? The first colonists, finding themselves alone in the wilderness of the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains, faced frosts that cracked stones and froze mercury in thermometers. They had no access to mineral wool, foam insulation, or central heating, but their homes retained heat better than many of today's cottages. These people used knowledge passed down from generation to generation, turning mud, moss, and straw into an impenetrable barrier against the deadly cold. Their methods were not based on chemistry, but on a deep understanding of the physics of materials and the properties of the earth itself. Watch the video to the end to learn how the forgotten technology of the warm corner and simple clay allowed people to survive where modern humans would freeze to death in a single night. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of survival in open spaces where the wind never stops blowing. When pioneers ventured into the vast expanses of Nebraska or Dakota, they found a complete lack of timber for classic log cabins. The only material available under their feet was the earth itself, tightly woven with the roots of tough prairie grass. It was this sod that became the basis for the construction of the famous sod houses, which surpassed brick and wood in their thermal insulation properties. The walls of such a house were up to 3 feet thick, creating a thermos effect that was unattainable for lightweight frame structures. In winter, the earthen walls retained the accumulated heat for weeks, and in summer they kept the house cool even in the most scorching heat. Construction began with cutting layers of turf that resembled giant bricks created by nature itself. A plow pulled by oxen cut off the top layer of soil in strips of a certain width, which were then chopped into equal pieces with shovels. These earthen blocks were laid with the grass facing down so that the root system would continue to bind the soil and prevent it from crumbling over time. Each row was necessarily laid with thin branches or twigs for binding, similar to how reinforcement is used in concrete today. The walls were erected with a slight inward slope to compensate for settling and prevent collapse under their own weight. Over time, this construction only became stronger as the roots continued to grow and intertwine. The uniqueness of the turf house lay in its absolute airtightness, which is impossible to recreate in modern prefabricated houses. The wind, capable of blowing through a wooden hut through the smallest cracks, was powerless against a meter-thick layer of compressed earth. The absence of seams and joints, characteristic of log buildings, prevented drafts from blowing out precious heat. Inside such a dwelling, there was always a special silence as the earthen walls absorbed any sounds of the raging elements outside. This created a psychological feeling of safety and comfort in the midst of a hostile wasteland where blizzards and hurricanes reigned. Interestingly, turf had the ability to regulate humidity inside the room naturally, absorbing excess moisture and releasing it when dry. This prevented condensation from forming on the walls, which often caused mold in wooden or stone buildings of that time. The inhabitants of such houses rarely suffered from lung diseases, as the air inside always remained clean and moderately humid. The earth acted as a giant filter, trapping dust and soot from the hearth and preventing them from settling on surfaces. The heat capacity of such walls was so high that even after the hearth had completely burned out, the temperature in the house dropped very slowly. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think about living in a house made entirely of earth and grass? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth that not every log can save you from death at minus 40 degrees? When settlers reached the wooded areas of the Rocky Mountains, they were faced with the need to carefully select wood for their log cabins. Many mistakenly believe that any thick tree is suitable for construction, but experienced trappers knew much more about thermal conductivity. They looked for trees that grew on northern slopes or in dense thickets, where slow growth ensured high density of annual rings. Such dense wood acted as a heat accumulator, unlike the loose trunks of fast-growing pines from southern edges. The timing of logging was no less important for the future thermal insulation properties of a dwelling than the choice of tree species. Logging could only be done in the depths of winter, when the movement of sap in the trunk completely stopped due to frost. During this period, the wood was as dry as possible, which prevented its severe deformation and cracking in the future. Summer wood, filled with moisture, developed deep cracks when it dried, through which the wind blew all the heat out of the isba. Experienced craftsmen could identify winter wood by the sound of the axe striking it, which rang out rather than sticking in the wood. The bark had to be removed from the logs immediately to prevent rot and allow the wood to dry evenly. Leaving the bark on created air pockets where moisture accumulated, destroying the structure of the wood and reducing its heat retention. The clean trunks were stacked on spacers so that air could circulate freely around each log. The drying process could take from 1 to 2 years, and only a patient builder would obtain material of ideal quality. Those who were impatient and began construction with green wood doomed themselves to years of struggling with drafts and cold. An interesting nuance was the use of resinous wood species for the lower crowns of the log house, which were in contact with damp soil. The resin naturally preserved the wood, preventing it from rotting and losing its insulating properties. For the upper crowns and walls, lighter species were preferred, as they contained more microscopic air chambers. It was this air, trapped inside the wood fibers, that was the main insulator in the structure. The right combination of wood species made it possible to create a balanced structure that was resistant to any weather. The thickness of the logs also played a decisive role, but the rule, the thicker, the better, did not always work. Logs that were too thick were difficult to fit together, which led to wide gaps between the crowns. A diameter of 10 to 12 inches was considered optimal, providing a balance between insulation and tightness. Logs were selected to be of the same diameter along their entire length to avoid wall distortions. Any unevenness in the trunk required additional processing and increased the risk of cold bridges. An important secret was the use of a so-called moon groove when stacking logs on top of each other. A semicircular longitudinal notch was cut into the lower log, which perfectly matched the contour of the upper log. This simple rule extended the life of the log house and improved its characteristics at no cost. In the next chapter, you will learn about the secret ingredient that was added to the mortar to make the walls harder than stone. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of building mixtures of the past? Even the best log cabins always had gaps between the logs that needed to be filled with something to make them airtight. The settlers developed unique recipes for a filler called chinking, which was much more complex than simple clay. The ideal mixture had to be plastic so that it would not crack when the logs moved, and hard as stone to withstand the rain. Each family kept its own recipe for this mortar, passing it down as a great treasure. The basis of the mixture was always clay, which was extracted from riverbanks or ravines near the construction site. The clay was soaked in water for several days to make it completely pliable and homogeneous. Then it was thoroughly kneaded with the feet, removing all stones and hard lumps that could spoil the mortar. The quality of the clay was checked by rolling it into a sausage and wrapping it around a finger. If it did not crack, the material was excellent. It was hard physical labor in which all members of the settler group often participated. The second essential component was slaked lime, which was obtained by burning limestone in homemade kilns. Lime gave the mixture antiseptic properties, preventing the appearance of mold and fungus in the joints between the logs. It also made the hardened mortar more durable and resistant to erosion by slanting rain. The white color of the lime gave the house an elegant appearance, contrasting with the dark logs of the walls. The process of slaking lime was dangerous and required caution, as it was accompanied by the release of large amounts of heat. To give the mortar tensile strength, reinforcing fibers of natural origin were added to it. Most often, animal wool collected during the molting of bison or deer was used. Finely chopped dry grass, straw, or even human hair collected from barber shops and villages were also used. These fibers acted as micro-reinforcement, holding the clay and lime together even when the log house was severely deformed. Without them, the mortar would have crumbled out of the joints after the first winter. The secret ingredient, which few people know about today, was ordinary wood ash from a fire. Ash, especially from hardwoods, reacted chemically with lime and water to create something similar to modern cement. It made the mortar incredibly hard and accelerated the process of its hardening in the open air. The proportions of ash were selected empirically and depended on the fat content of the original clay. A properly prepared mixture with ash could last for decades without repair. This border cement was an example of perfect adaptation to the environment and the use of improvised materials. It transformed a roughly assembled log cabin into a monolithic structure capable of withstanding any weather conditions. Walls coated with this mixture became impervious to wind and retained precious heat inside. Even today, when restoring old huts, craftsmen are amazed at the strength of this homemade material. If you enjoy learning about such forgotten technologies, don't forget to like this video. What if I showed you a material that outperforms modern insulation and grows right on trees? Before applying the clay mortar, the gaps between the logs had to be tightly filled with a resilient material. The best choice for this purpose was long fiber moss, which was collected in swamps or damp forest lowlands. Moss had unique antiseptic properties, preventing wood rot in the most vulnerable areas of the joints. It worked like a sponge, compressing under the weight of the logs and filling in the smallest irregularities and voids. Collecting moss was an important stage in preparing for construction, which was done by entire families. It had to be collected in huge quantities and carefully dried in the sun before use. Wet moss laid in the wall inevitably led to the rotting of the logs and the destruction of the house. Dry moss, on the other hand, became elastic and durable, retaining its properties for decades. It was laid out in a thick layer on each crown before the next log was laid. The second most popular material for caulking was tow, made from hemp or flax fibers. These were crops that settlers grew not only for fabric, but also for construction. Hemp was stronger than moss and easier to pack into narrow gaps using a special wooden spatula. The fibers were twisted into bundles and hammered into the gaps with force until the tool began to bounce off the elastic material. Sometimes old rags, pieces of worn clothing, or woolen blankets cut into strips were used. In conditions of scarcity on the frontier, nothing was thrown away, and every rag found its use. The fabric was impregnated with tar or resin to make it waterproof and protect it from rotting. This was a less durable option, but it saved the day in the early years of life in a new place. An interesting solution was to use dry corn cobs to fill particularly large gaps. The cobs were tightly packed into the holes and then covered with clay mortar. The porous structure of the cob served as an excellent heat insulator, trapping air inside. This was an inventive use of agricultural waste to improve living conditions. The combination of natural insulation and engineering ingenuity created houses that could withstand any storm. In the next chapter, you will learn why earthen floors were sometimes warmer than wooden ones. The laws of physics work just as relentlessly on the frontier as they do in a modern laboratory, and settlers learned them quickly. They understood perfectly well that warm air rises to the ceiling and cold air spreads across the floor. Therefore, the construction of the floor and ceiling was critical to maintaining a comfortable temperature in the home. Many early homes had simply packed earth floors, not because of poverty, but because of practicality. The ground under the house had a stable temperature and, being insulated from the wind, did not freeze as much as raised plank flooring. However, earthen floors were cold to the touch and damp, so over time people tried to replace them with wood. Classic floors were made of planks, logs split in half and laid flat side up. The rounded lower part of the plank lay on the ground or on joists, and the gaps between them were tightly packed with clay. Such a floor was extremely thick and heavy, acting as a heat accumulator. Walking on such massive wood was much warmer than on thin boards, which were drafty from below. The space under the floor, if there was any, was tightly closed for the winter, creating a so-called zavalinka. A mound of earth, turf, or snow was piled up around the perimeter of the house to protect the space under the floor from the wind. This prevented the circulation of icy air under the boards and retained the heat coming from the ground. Without a zavalinka, even the best floor turned into an icy slab that sucked the heat out of your feet. The vents in the foundation were only opened in the spring to dry out the crawl space. The ceiling was the main source of precious heat loss, so even more attention was paid to insulating it than to the walls. The ceiling beams were covered with poles or split boards, trying to fit them as tightly as possible. On top of this flooring, a layer of birch bark or oiled paper was laid, which served as a vapor barrier. This layer prevented moist, warm air from the living quarters from penetrating the insulation and wetting it. An intriguing hook at the beginning. What if I told you that the shape of the corner of your house could cost you your life? Corners have always been the weakest point of any wooden structure, as this is where the logs froze the fastest. Settlers developed several types of lock joints, but the most effective for retaining heat was the so-called dovetail or warm corner. This complex geometric shape of the cut not only firmly held the logs together, but also created a maze for cold air. Only a true master could make such a corner, but the result was worth all the effort. When cutting in the paw or dovetail, the ends of the logs did not protrude beyond the wall, but formed a neat, smooth corner. The inclined planes of the joint were calculated so that under the weight of the log house, the lock would self-lock. The heavier the house, the tighter the joints in the corners became, preventing gaps from appearing. This type of lock also excellently drained rainwater, preventing it from flowing into the joint and causing rot. A hidden spike was often left inside the corner joint, which fit into the groove of the lower log. This element, invisible from the outside, completely blocked direct air access through the corner. It was a kind of windlock that made the corner windproof even in a strong hurricane. Cutting out such a spike required precision work with an axe and chisel. Another popular method was to cut into the bowl, with a residue where the ends of the logs stuck out crosswise. Although this required more wood, the protruding ends protected the corner itself from wind and rain. They created air turbulence, reducing the wind speed directly at the wall and reducing heat loss. In addition, the thick ends of the logs warmed up in the sun and transferred heat into the castle. The ability to cut warm corners was the highest level of carpentry skill on the frontier. It was the geometry of survival, where every edge and every slope was vitally important. In the next chapter, you will learn about the ventilation paradox, how to keep the air fresh without letting the heat escape up the chimney. The hearth was the heart of the home, providing warmth and food, but it was also the main enemy of a well-insulated dwelling. The huge open fireplaces we are used to seeing in films about the Wild West were actually monstrously inefficient. They sucked huge amounts of heated air out of the room and expelled it into the chimney along with the smoke. The efficiency of such a fireplace barely reached 10%, and the rest of the heat was lost to the sky. Settlers quickly realized that they needed more efficient heating methods to survive. The solution was the widespread introduction of cast iron stoves, which began to appear on the frontier with the development of railways. The stove, standing in the center of the room, gave off heat with its entire surface, heating the air rather than the walls of the chimney. A long pipe running through the entire room served as an additional radiator, giving off the last bits of heat from the smoke. This system allowed a house to be heated with an armful of firewood, which would only last half an hour in a fireplace. However, the fire required a supply of fresh air, and this is where the problem of drafts arose. If the house was too airtight, the stove began to smoke, and people suffocated from lack of oxygen. Settlers had to organize a regulated air supply, often bringing it directly to the stove's firebox from under the floor. This allowed the stove to breathe cold outside air without cooling the living space. The location of the stove in the house was carefully thought out to ensure even heat circulation. It was usually placed in the center of the largest room so that warm air would spread to all corners naturally. The partitions between rooms often did not reach the ceiling, allowing warm air to flow into the bedrooms. This created a single thermal circuit for the entire dwelling. The stone and brick used to build massive stoves or fireplaces acted as heat accumulators. A massive stove heated in the evening remained warm until morning, giving off gentle heat. This eliminated the need to get up at night and add wood to the fire, which was important for a good night's sleep. The size of the stone structure was calculated based on the volume of the house and the severity of the climate. In the Southwest, where the enemy was the scorching sun instead of frost, the principles of insulation worked in reverse, but using the same laws of physics. Here, adobe reigned supreme. Unfired bricks made of clay and straw, dried in the sun. The adobe walls were made very thick, often more than 2 feet, to create enormous thermal mass. During the day, these walls slowly absorbed the heat of the desert, preventing it from entering the house where it remained cool. At night, when the desert temperature dropped sharply, the heat stored in the walls began to radiate into the rooms. This natural cycle smoothed out daily temperature fluctuations, maintaining a comfortable microclimate around the clock. Adobe was the ideal material for a climate with large temperature differences. It did not require fuel for heating at night or ice for cooling during the day. Building with adobe required a large amount of water to mix the clay, which was a problem in the desert. Therefore, construction was often planned near rare water sources or during the rainy season, with bricks being made in advance. The bricks were formed in wooden frames and left to dry in the sun for weeks, turning them periodically. The quality of the bricks depended on the correct proportion of clay and sand. The roofs of such houses were made flat and thick, covering them with a layer of earth to insulate them from the midday sun. The roof overhangs were not made large, but wooden beams protruding from the walls, called vigas, were used. These beams not only supported the roof, but also served to hang peppers or corn to dry. The roof structure had to withstand rare but heavy rainstorms. Mountain hunters and trappers who spent their winters alone in the snow could not build permanent houses. Their lives depended on their ability to create a temporary but warm shelter a couple of hours before nightfall. A snow cave was one of the most effective shelters, using the insulating properties of the snow itself. Snow, which is 90% air, is an excellent insulator if you know how to use it. A properly constructed snow cave maintained a temperature of around 0 degrees, even when it was 40 degrees below zero outside. The entrance to the cave was always made below floor level to create a cold trap. Warm air from the body and breath rose up into the living area, while heavy cold air flowed down into the exit tunnel. This simple physics saved the lives of thousands of people. Inside the cave, the ceiling was always leveled, making it a smooth dome so that drops of meltwater would run down the walls instead of dripping on the inhabitants. The walls were sealed, creating an ice crust that reflected heat back inside. A single candle was enough to raise the temperature inside to a comfortable level. A trapper could sleep in such a shelter without the risk of freezing. Another type of temporary shelter was the lean-to, a canopy with a heat reflector from the fire. A sloping roof was built from branches and spruce branches, with the open side facing the fire. Behind the fire, a wall of logs or stones was erected to reflect the heat into the shelter. The person was in the thermal focus between the fire and the canopy. The use of animal skins was an essential element in insulating any temporary dwelling. A bison or bear skin spread out on pine branches created an impenetrable barrier from the cold ground. Wrapping himself in a fur blanket, the trapper created a microclimate around his body. The fur on the outside protected against snow, while the fur on the inside retained heat. A house on the frontier was never a finished object. It was a living organism that required constant care and adjustment. Each season brought its own concerns. In the fall, the caulking had to be checked, and in the spring, the washed-out foundation had to be repaired. The logs dried out, birds pecked at the moss, and the clay cracked from the heat. The owner had to constantly monitor the health of his home, otherwise it would quickly fall into ruin. The process of log house shrinkage could last several years, and during this time it was necessary to adjust the windows and doors and trim the jambs. If the moment was missed, the log house could hang on the window frames, and huge gaps would form between the crowns. It was a dynamic struggle against gravity and the geometry of the wood. Houses often talked at night, creaking and crackling, which was normal. Fighting wood-boring insects was part of maintaining the thermal insulation, as beetles could turn a log into dust. The walls were impregnated with solutions of salt, tar, or decoctions of bitter herbs. Sometimes it was necessary to replace entire logs in an already built house, which was a very difficult engineering operation. The house was lifted with jacks or wedges to remove the rotten log. Filling the foundation gap was an annual ritual of preparation for winter, in which children participated. Fresh earth or straw created a new protective belt around the base of the house. In the spring, this earth had to be raked away so that the logs could dry out and not rot. This cycle was repeated year after year, marking the change of seasons. The roof had to be inspected after every heavy storm, and any pieces of bark or shingles that had been torn off had to be replaced. A leak in the attic meant wet insulation, which would no longer retain heat and would begin to rot. A dry ceiling was the key to a warm winter. We have come a long way from dugouts to log fortresses and have seen that true thermal insulation is not a product from a store, but the result of observation and hard work. Settlers did not conquer nature, but cooperated with it, using the properties of earth, wood, and moss to protect their lives. Their methods may seem primitive, but they have been tested by the harshest conditions imaginable. Modern homes are full of electronics, but often lack the simple and reliable physics that made a trapper's hut warmer than a city mansion. Maybe we should sometimes look back to find solutions for the future? Write in the comments what topic from frontier life you would like to explore in the next issue. Medicine, weapons, or cooking? And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories.